If you've never sat down and asked yourself the question, how did I form my view of sexuality? Like whatever view that you hold, how did you get that? It's bigger than just like stop looking at porn. It's bigger than just stop sleeping around. I've got to get to the root of my sexual formation. I got to get to the root of my story. And I got to do some digging on like, man, why do I respond this way? Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Rooted podcast. Where we try to get to the root of the problem, not just the surface level issue. In fact, we say if you want the fruit,
you have to get to the root.
That's right. Get to the root problem. Today we are actually doing something a little bit different. We're circling back to the message that we had Sunday, and we actually just finished an entire teaching series called Controversial Christianity. I had a really cool conversation with a pastor friend of mine. We were just talking about people's response to hard topics. I think a lot of times so many preachers or Christians are afraid to have hard conversations, but what I have found in our own church, and I think you can attest to this, Tyler, is people are hungry for it. Because one, they want to know, like, I want to know how to have these conversations. I want to know, like, what does the Bible say? How do I approach this as a Christian? I think we are because we have nominal Christianity growing at a large rate where so many people go to church but don't read their Bible. We're also having more and more ignorance when it comes to, like, we start just repeating cultural slogans, or we start like almost compromising our faith and beliefs because we are trying to live in a culture of how do we live at peace with people, but yet also live in the truth. And so, man, I thought it was a very helpful series. It seems like our church has really responded well. Yeah. And even this past week, the one that we want to talk about today is the question of, like, why does God care about my sexuality? We talked about this earlier as a staff, but just, man, there was such a sweet spirit in all three worship experiences this past Sunday as we tried to approach this topic with truth, courage, but also grace and an invitation for people just to come and come have a conversation. And so today, that's what we want to do. We want to circle back to this conversation because I think it's something that you don't just talk about one time. I think that, like, we're going to have multiple conversations around this idea and topic of sexuality, because it is, I think I shared this Sunday, that it is the most prominent. I mean, you're talking about where it is people who are passing laws. It is a major part of our identity as a nation. People are finding more and more of their identity in their sexuality. And so I don't think there's ever been a society or a culture that has done that, where we are legislating it, right? Even. And used to, sexuality was a very private thing, and now it's like it's such a kind of almost like an empowering deal to talk about your sexuality in a way that makes that the primary identity of your life. And so we want to circle back to that conversation because I think on this podcast specifically, we talk about getting to root issues. Yeah. And one of the questions we asked people to wrestle with this past Sunday was, if you don't know, if you've never sat down and asked yourself the question, how did I form my view of sexuality? Like, whatever view that you hold, how did you get that? Because I have conversations with good friends all the time where they're just like, I just believe, God loves everybody and God just wants everybody to be happy, yada, yada. Like, that's fine if you say you believe that. My question is, how did you get that belief? Like, what is the foundation that holds that true? And so what we talked about is there are 4 stories that people live in. I think we really want to touch on 2 of them in particular. The first one is the sociology story, right? And we talked about how, like, the worldview of sex in that story is that sex equals power. That, man, the more sex you have, or the more you can find an identity and then build rules and regulations and laws around that uphold that and put that on the stage in the forefront, then you have more power, right? And we talked about how the only value of that worldview is consent. Like, it doesn't matter how many partners you have, it doesn't matter what gender, all those things, as long as you have consent. But the problem is that comes from a very neo-Marxist worldview, and it's just it's a very unhealthy story that's affected a lot of people. And the second one was secularism. We talked about secularism. All it does is tend to push God and religion out of everything. Like, you may have some verses that mean a lot to you, but it holds no authority in my life because there's no absolute truth. And when there's no absolute truth, then really the main goal or the main worldview of secularism is pleasure. And so the goal becomes fulfillment. How do I fulfill pleasure? And like, it doesn't matter, again, what I do with my sexuality, as long as it's making me happy and I am fulfilled. The problem is that when individuals seek their own pleasure and fulfillment, you will always oppress and hurt other people. And by the way, as we're talking about this topic, can we agree there's no other thing that has affected people deeply, whether it's jobs being lost, trauma, relationships, violence over sex. And so I think it's very important that we realize that this conversation can't just be one we skip around. It's got to be had on a regular basis.
Yeah, because I think 100% affects people physically, 100% affects people mentally, and it affects their spiritual walk because their view is skewed. I thought you said something so good this past Sunday about, and I think the reason why a lot of times people don't want to talk about this, one, because I don't think they're confident in their own education, because you said far too often just what we just throw out there is, well, it's what the Bible says, and that's like the extent of the conversation, or that the Bible's against it. That's and like, I love that we can take this time and actually unpack what the scriptures say, and not just throw a statement out there to excuse ourselves from having a conversation.
I think that leads to the third story that we talked about, which is the shame story.
Yes.
And that story, actually, if you grew up in church, especially in the early 2000s with the whole purity movement, the I Kiss Dating Goodbye, theory, like, the whole worldview of the shame story is purity. And the problem is the only value out of that story is moralism. And I shared this on how, like, man, there are a lot of Christians who, like, they actually prioritize purity over salvation. That, man, as long as my kids don't get knocked up before they get married or before they get out of high school and they don't end up gay, then they're really happy. Even though they've never taught them how to follow Jesus, there's no other Christian values other than just, like, don't have sex, don't ever talk about it, stay away from gross. And there's almost what happens is, and there are a lot of people who enter into marriage out of that type of worldview that they almost can't even, like, connect with their spouse because they are so afraid of sex and their sexuality when God gave it to us as a gift.
Yeah, if all of you've heard all your life or a lot of your teenage years into your adulthood is that it's gross, don't do it, it's bad, and all of a sudden a switch is supposed to go off on your honeymoon night with your spouse. And when, like, what am I supposed to do with years worth of don't, gross, it's bad, and all of a sudden it's okay? Well,
and most of it's because, like, parents don't know how to talk about it. They talk about it from a mechanic standpoint, but not from a biblical worldview. And so we talked about how that's the fourth story. The fourth story is the secular story. And the secular story is the worldview of sex is that it is a picture of something beyond ourselves.
Yeah.
That the union of two souls, the union of two people, is a representation of heaven. And we talked about this, making the invisible visible.
Yep.
And then that the value is that, man, I get to be selfless and give myself for another human being.
Yeah.
That there is a gift that I'm giving them. We talked about how Christ gave himself for us, gave himself up for the church. And it's crazy how the Bible talks about the church as a bride and that he is the groomsman. And so isn't it incredible how, like, sex, marriage, all of that is really a picture of something bigger than ourselves. Paul talks about that in Ephesians 5. He says, man, this mystery, he's like, it's even hard to describe this mystery of how, like, the church and Jesus are like a husband and a wife, and how, like, man, when you are interacting intimately with your spouse, it's actually showing you a beautiful picture of the mystery of how God loves us and the relationship that he has for us. And so some of the stuff we want to talk about today briefly is just, like, getting to the root of how people's sexual formation happen. Because here was the challenge is, like, man, if you're going to dive into your own spiritual formation when it comes to discipleship to Jesus, It's the same way with sexual formation,
Mm-hmm.
that all of us were formed in a specific worldview, whether we knew it consciously or not. And so I just want you to take a minute
Yeah.
and kind of share like maybe how your sexual formation, the story that you grew up in, and how it affected you and kind of formed you today.
Yeah. So I grew up in some of that purity, like the purity culture. And again, not that it was a bad thing, but
Correct.
it was
But
prioritized.
the value, right?
Correct.
The value is moralism, not becoming like Jesus.
Yeah,
right?
and so like, and in some of the shame, I remember when I found out about sex was at church camp, and not, and when I
probably the average teenager.
yeah, and not in like a
today's
way
church
of like,
culture,
hey, let's talk about this. No, it was late at night in the dorm. You know, there was a joke that was made, and I was like, okay,
what is that?
yeah, and I was confused. I felt dirty immediately. I felt nasty. Like, I'm not supposed to know this.
Yeah.
And I'm about to have to go home. And my parents, they know when something's up. You know, I can't. They're like, you know, what's wrong? And like, I remember like, hey, this was said. Like, is this true, or is this what this looks? You know, all of the. I don't even think I was in middle school yet. So still in elementary school, finding this stuff out, and immediate just guilt of like, oh no. And so I went on to talk, you know, had conversations with my parents, and you know, had the conversations and all of those. And there were some things at that time. Again, it's like, we'll tell you, you know, we're not, age appropriate conversation. But I grew up in a lot of some of the. Man, I even remember, and I'm just going to be very vulnerable here. I remember when I was in a position, being a teenager, in a spot where I should not have been, and ended up losing my virginity. And there was like this moment of like, I need to call and brag about this. Like, I remember that. And then also in that shame of like, some of that power stuff you talk about, you're like, man, I conquered this type mentality, which was it's not a healthy spot to be in, which led to we don't have time for uncomfortable conversations with my wife later on in life. And it just but then there was the shame that kicked in. But it also is like, once I was introduced to it, it also led to patterns. And like, again, it's like I believe I read that the amount of dopamine that hits your body when you're doing those things is like equivalent to someone who does cocaine. And so it's like, no one wants to, like, you think about sex and pleasure and stuff like that, you're not want to compare yourself to that type of addict, but it will 100% lead to an addiction and a road that, I mean, I walked down it. I did. And, but I was in that shame, power kind of dancing, and did not look at it from a gift one day. It was more of, what can I receive? And I think that is a place that if we're honest, right, this is what this is about. This whole conversation about being transparent, and being honest about these things. It was not healthy.
Well, the thing about the shame story, right? It leads to hypocrisy, because if you're in shame, that means you don't have the safe place to talk about, like confess sin, or confess struggles, or confess thoughts or inner workings, because there's like this unspoken expectation, like that, man, you're just supposed to like make sure that you don't look at porn, you don't lust after women, you don't do these things. And when you create that, when that is the goal, like anytime you try to make any kind of morality the goal, it leads to hypocrisy, because you're trying to live by the law. But when the goal is Jesus, to be like Jesus, be with Jesus, do what Jesus did, now these things are a means to an end. It's understanding that my goal in life is not to remain pure before I get married, or to be straight my entire life, or whatever. The goal is to know Jesus. And as Jesus begins to change my heart and life, he starts to shape my sexual formation, just like he does my spiritual formation. He helps shape how I view the opposite sex, how I view relationships, how I view marriage, how I view family. Even that. There are people who get married, are straight, all those things, but they still have a twisted view of what those things are for. You said it perfectly. I think sometimes the shame story bleeds into the secular story, because at the end of the day, if sex to you, or if your sexual formation has everything to do with gratitude. I've heard people even say like, well, men have needs. That is not a biblical statement. I think it's dangerous when you say things like that. Because
like
what
sexual
that does,
narcissism, like
it's very, yes. And so I heard somebody, this is so good, man. A conversation we're just having recently, ministering to somebody, and they were basically talking about like their porn struggle, their porn addiction, how the intimacy between them and their spouse wasn't good. And this is a powerful statement. He said, my wife doesn't enjoy sex, and it's painful, it's whatever, it's not fun. And the question then was reversed to him of saying like, maybe it's not that she doesn't enjoy sex, she doesn't enjoy you. Because the way that you have approached sex has been like, when are you going to give me what I want? When do I get what I need? Instead of like, how am I stirring up intimacy and creating intimacy with my spouse where I know them, to where sex is a byproduct of the intimacy. It is not intimacy itself. And so I think that's where we're off. And what you don't realize is that in that moment, when you make that statement, both of them have a sexual formation that is from the wrong story. And when people have walked through, when women have walked through rape or sexual abuse or molestation, that will bleed over into your view of even how sex happens in the marriage. Because I think all of us want the fulfillment and the fullness of what God has to offer when it comes to sexual intimacy. Yeah. That God created that in us. And we talked about that on Sunday of how, like, man, this idea of, I mean, when you think about how God created us, it is incredible.
It's crazy.
On how, like, every part of our body, like even when it comes to sex, like the feelings you get, the emotions that it comes with, the how your chemicals in your brain work, the heart. God's like, I created this for you, for the pleasure, for the fulfillment, but it's a covenant. It is to be done in a covenant relationship. Because when you try to connect that to multiple partners in a way that is not flourishing to the heart, mind, soul, and body, then we have to ask ourselves, am I living in the correct story? And I think that's the stuff that we're trying to get to when we talk about this stuff. We said this earlier, that people who struggle with pornography, you don't have a porn problem. You have a sexual formation problem. You know, going back to my story is all the stories into one. You know, it was like I came from a family that didn't even go to church, honor God, but yet there was still, like, you still had the same conversation as a teenager. I found that so fast. I don't know if you're listening and you experience that, where you have a family dynamic that's not even really trying to live according to the Bible, except for when it comes to sex. And it's like all of a sudden, it's like wired in us to have the same conversation, where it's like, hey, whatever you do, it's a lot better if you don't do it till you're married. But if you're going to do it, be safe. That was kind of like my talk. I remember my dad, my biological father, who, God rest his soul, like, we didn't have a relationship till we were 15. And one of the first conversations we had after me just getting to know my biological father was him driving me to school as a sophomore, having a conversation about sex. But it wasn't stay pure. It was don't get them pregnant. Yeah. You know, and I think, like, that's how I was. My formation became like, this is, you want to do this, but if you get them pregnant, that's the ultimate sin. Well, man, and that's how children end up becoming demonized. That's where, you know, abortions become like, man, it's just, it doesn't really matter. Or, you know, that's where you see all these broken homes where single moms or single parents, and the children don't know their parents, and the children don't know the father. And what we don't realize is, like, man, the kids are the ones that suffer. Yes. 'Cause now they're viewed as the mistake. They're viewed as the thing. That's why, like, it's so important, man. If you're listening and you have a teenage daughter or son, or you are a teenager listening, and you have a child, or you have a child on the way, I want you to hear me say this. The child is not the curse. The child is not the sin. The child is not punishment. The child is just a biological consequence of what God intended for when a man and a woman come together. You produce life. But, man, the shame and the guilt that comes with teen pregnancy. My mother was a teen mom. You know, like, her doctor asked her, do you want to abort this baby? And my mother had to wrestle with, like, man, do I do that? And man, she told her doctor, like, no, I believe my son is going to do great things.
Yeah.
You know, I want to have him.
That's good.
And she lived a very rough life just trying to do her best to be the best mom she could. But she never saw me as the problem. And I think that's important for people to hear, because I think, again, that should tell you a lot about the root of your sexual story. If you view family, children, or any kind of covenant or commitment as the thing that's weighing you down, or the burden. If that is the burden, then you are living in a selfish story. You are living in a story where people exist for me to extract pleasure from, and life exists for me to extract pleasure from. And when you live that way, that is called secularism. It's called hedonism. It's where I'm trying to maximize pleasure, minimize pain. And it's just a selfish way to look at things. And so for me, like, being exposed to pornography at the age of 8 and being in a over-sexualized, stimulated culture in my home, and what I saw growing up, being sexually abused by three different people over a period of 2 years, it formed in me a different view of sex. You know, that, man, if I'm going to be a man, kind of like you said, like, man, when the first time, dude, same way, man, 13 years old, that's how old I was. And the feeling of, like, I'm a man.
Yeah. I accomplished something.
Now, like, dude, that's so twisted.
It is.
It's so twisted. But it's because of the story that I grew up in. And so what you got to know is, like, if you're listening and you came out of some of these things and you're trying to follow Jesus, you got to know that just as a part of you're trying to, like, form, I think so many people, like, when it comes to following Jesus, they, you know, it's like the big sins, right? But really it's bigger than just, like, stop looking at porn. It's bigger than just stop sleeping around. It's, I've got to get to the root of my sexual formation.
Yeah.
I got to get to the root of my story. And I got to do some digging on, like, man, why do I respond this way? Why when I'm alone, I'm tired and I'm stressed, why is my automatic response to go to my phone and scroll? Because here's what I know about people listening right now, is that most people don't sit and go, like, I want to look at porn right now. It usually starts with, I'm going to get on Snapchat. Oh, man, that's interesting. Or I'm going to get on Instagram, scroll. Oh, man, look at that ad. Get on YouTube. And it starts with the small things. Or it starts with, like, man, I love this TV show. I love this show. And here's what's crazy, is that we've created the Netflix culture. It's basically made soft porn the norm for television. I don't even think people realize this has happened. But, like, when I go to watch a movie or watch a show, I always look at the ratings. And if there's an MA, which means mature, then you have to look, like, what does that mean? Right. It's crazy to me. I can't stand it when people say, like, I didn't even know that stuff was in there. I started watching, and I'm like, you can literally read descriptions before you watch something. Sexual conduct. Yeah, sexual content. And, man, you can ask my wife. You can ask my wife. If we start to watch a movie and it says it in there, we're like, we can't watch that. And that's a decision I had to make because it's a way for me to deform the formation that's happened in me. Because mine wasn't like you run straight to the hardcore porn. You start with the soft stuff. You start with the images. You start with the scrolling. You start with the mindless. When your mind becomes an idle place of just randomness, you cannot be surprised when you have no control, self-control to your thoughts or to your actions. The mind is a powerful thing that God gave us that has to be shaped and formed. That's why Romans 12 says, be renewed by the transforming of your mind. Man, I talked to a dude. This was so powerful. He was coming to share his testimony at the juvenile detention center. Okay. And he said, man, I was a drug addict, a womanizer. He said, when I got saved, I would spend at least 12 hours. He said, man, I would spend all day in the Word for 2 years. He said, because I had to rewire my mind.
That's focus when your mind is.
But man, when you talk to him, and he could bring a Bible verse like that. Have you ever met people that's like, man, they're just really good at knowing the Bible? No, they're really good at practicing formation.
Yeah, that's good.
And that's what people don't understand. It's like, there's not like a smarter Bible person out there. There's people who are more committed to their formation than other people. Yeah. And so the one thing, when you get to the root of this stuff, that you have to ask yourself, do you want to be free? Yeah. The second question, how bad?
That's good. I think too, I want to just because I think parents, if you have kids and you're a parent, I want you to ask yourself that question.
Mm-hmm.
How bad? Because I think far too often we don't want to be us as parents, we don't want to be shamed or whatever because of a decision that our kid might have made. So we unconsciously condone it. You might not be by, oh, hey, well, I found out that my kid's having sex. Well, let me get them on birth control because I don't want to be shamed for my kid.
Don't get me started on
I
this,
witnessed
man.
this. And I remember it was like my 8th grade freshman year. I mean, because I found out, obviously the parents aren't going around, well, hey, I got them on birth control. They're out here. No, they don't. No, I found out because, hey, my mom put me on birth control because me and my boyfriend were having sex.
Bro, so this is the stuff that drives me nuts. And again, I got to watch myself because I know I come across as very judgmental sometimes. That's just my personality. But like, obviously everybody has different values when they parent. I think the thing that really, though, that disappoints me or discourages me are people who say they value something, but they live a different way than what they say they value. And what I mean by that is, like, you can't say you value your kid's mental state, emotional state, and relational state when you allow them. Like, it blows my mind, like 4th, 5th, 6th grade, like parents taking their kids' boyfriends and girlfriends on vacations with them, allowing them to spend a lot of time together. Like,
alone.
If you allow your 12, 13, 14-year-old to spend as much or more time with their boyfriend or girlfriend, whatever you want to call them, than you do with your own family or in formation or in community, then to me, that's a problem. You are actually setting them up for failure. You're setting them up for these things to happen. And then you're surprised when it happens. And I think, man, there's such a level of responsibility that parents almost aren't willing to take because they're afraid that their kids are going to be like, it amazes me in this culture how parents are terrified that all of a sudden they're not going to be cool to their kids.
Right.
And I think, man, at some point you got to realize, man, I want my kids, I don't care whether or not they think I'm cool. I care that when they're adults, that one, we're still friends, that we still, they come to me for advice. They want to come home, because we've created a safe environment for us to have real hard conversations and tell them the whys behind why we make certain decisions. Like, my girls knew, like, hey, not until you're 16 can you even entertain the fact of, like, possibly going on a date. And so it's like, you know, we would always get that, well, so-and-so's got a crush on me. Once one, I was, oh, okay, cool. Let him keep crushing. In 6 months,
they can keep crushing.
He'll have a crush on somebody else. Yeah. Because that's what happens as teenagers. Especially with boys. I try to tell my girls all the time, boys are going to mature later than you.
Yep.
And so just know, I know they're saying and doing a lot of things that makes you feel like you're really valuable to them. They will turn around in 6 months and have the same kind of feelings towards somebody else. It's called hormones.
Yes.
And so, like, parents need to be a little bit, like, more forthcoming and truthful in that, instead of like, well, I don't want to discourage them. You know, I don't want to tell them they don't know what love is. It's like, no, they might know what love is. They're not mature enough to harness it.
Yeah. And I think it points back to, because parents haven't dealt with some stuff at the moment that conversation gets opened up. One, they're not educated enough, and they're probably shameful or what all of these things. And so we'll just get you on birth control so you don't get pregnant.
I tell my daughters, like, listen, when you get to know somebody and they're wanting to get married or they're wanting to date, like, you need to ask them really hard questions that make them squirm. Like, hey, are you watching pornography currently? Do you have a pornography problem? What is your history like? Because those are questions not to shame, guilt, or condemn them, but it's getting to know the person. Getting the real.
Dude, I remember Lindsay asked me after we started dating for several months, she goes, what is one thing that I don't know about you? And which opened up, I was like, there's probably some stuff you don't want to know about, you know, which, but I'm grateful that she asked that question, because I don't know if I'm just going to go volunteering, you know.
Well, we did a series, just a little plug. You can go back on our, where can we go to watch old sermons, Juan? Can we send people like to old sermons? We're at. Yeah, put the link.
Okay.
Put the link to the Beds and Baggage series.
Oh, that's good. That's good.
But we have really close friends that they were dating at the time, right before they got engaged, and they literally took every application from that sermon. And one of the applications was, hey, if you're dating somebody now and you're not getting married, you need to go have a conversation and begin unpacking baggage.
Yes, that was so good.
Before you get married. because you need to know what you're dealing with, because you don't want to get
Yeah.
married and go like, man, I had no intention of washing these dirty socks
Yep.
or getting into this mess. And they did that. And, man, it's made their marriage so much more healthier. They can attest. I think they just celebrated 3 years.
Sounds right.
Yeah. But, man, watching their marriage flourish has been such a cool gift, and it's because they took that stuff serious on the
And to
front end.
me, that's like, if you're going to get married, you know, having marriage counseling, like those are the conversations.
Yeah,
Not who do you
100%.
think should do the dishes,
Yeah.
or who should be
100%, man.
mowing the yard. Those are the conversations that I believe will actually, like, that's counseling. That's helping you prepare and not just coming in and throwing your. I love what you said. That was a few episodes about throwing our dirty laundry on. There's a sermon you preached at youth about that.
Yep.
And that's what we do sometimes. We just you wash them, you wash these clothes. So
Well, I want to encourage you. Juan's going to put the link to the Beds and Baggage series, but also there's a link to this past Sunday's sermon.
yes,
Talking about why does God care about my sexuality. This will be conversations we'll have throughout, the Rooted podcast, but today was just kind of circling back to a few of those points from Sunday's message. So if you want context, go back and watch the message. And man, I just want to encourage you, like, do the hard work, get to the root, like really get to the root of, like, how did I get to where I'm at with do I have a theologically driven biblical worldview of how God created sex, why God created my sexuality, and why it's important to him, and why we should value it a lot more than just superficial cultural idea. So
it's good.
Man, thank you guys for tuning in today.
Yeah.
And excited about our next episode. But just remember, on this episode, we want to confront, we want to confess, we want to construct. So hopefully we're talking about those deep things, we're confessing them, and then we're building habits, practices in our life to get to the root of the issue and find wholeness and healing.
Yeah.
So remember, to get the fruit,
You have to get to the root.
peace.
See you guys.